Let's get more on this. We're joined by TRT World's defense analyst, Oubai Shahbandar, joins me live in the studio. Oubai, good to see you again. So let's start with the drone attack. What more do we know about it and who might be behind it?
Well, this has been a very bad week for Russian military forces in Syria. As you mentioned, this is the second attack on the Russian permanent airbase in Hmeimim Latakia. No rebel faction has claimed publicly responsibility for this attack, but what we do know is that rebels in Syria are increasingly using weaponized drones as a tactic, and it's clear that they had to get very close to the Russian permanent military airbase to launch this attack. On New Year's Eve, rebels launched rockets and mortars that damaged at least 6 fighter aircraft on this very same airbase. So the fact that the rebels are now using these weaponized drones to target the Russians on this airbase is a significant escalation, and has many in Moscow worried that the Russians may be facing higher casualties for their forces that remain in Syria.
That's exactly right. I mean, as you say, the second attack in a week on the Russians. What is the bigger picture here in terms of the Russians? I mean, how much longer are they going to face these sort of casualties?
Absolutely. Well, let's not forget that President Putin himself was on this very same airbase just a few weeks ago, where he held a military parade with his forces. The Syrian regime's leader, Bashar al-Assad, was with him, and where the Russians had declared that the major combat operations were ending and that they were going to start moving their forces back home. Clearly, the Russians are still facing attacks. Rebels were able to get very close here. So the big picture here is whether or not the Russians can trust their allies with the Syrian regime to guard this airbase, and whether the Russians may be facing casualties or even more casualties the longer that their forces remain. We do know that Moscow signed a long-term military basing agreement with the Syrian regime for their forces on this airbase, the Hmeimim airbase. So it means that the Russian military is still going to be there, still going to be operating there. And just a few days ago, the head of the Russian General Staff declared that operations would continue, especially in the neighboring province of Idlib, to target what they call extremist forces. So the Russians are still very much in Syria, in the game, and they're still going to be facing resistance by Syrian rebels.
The Russians, of course, also involved with setting up these de-escalation zones in Syria with Turkey. What is going on with those? Because we're hearing about fighting going on in these de-escalation zones in Idlib. What is happening?
Well, just less than 100 kilometers away from the Russian airbase Hmeimim, you have a major military campaign ongoing, backed by the Russian Air Force in the province of Idlib. According to the UN, at least 60,000 civilians have been displaced. The Syrian regime is very much intent on recapturing the Idlib province. Remember, it's the last province controlled by rebel forces. With the support of the Russian military aircraft, they're trying to capture a strategic airbase that was captured by the rebels just 2 years ago, the Al-Dahor airbase in the Idlib province. Heavy fighting ongoing. We saw some horrific pictures posted on social media of the regime's barrel bombs being launched against civilian towns and villages. Reports of even maternity wards being destroyed, hospitals, medical centers. Thousands are fleeing to the Turkish-Syrian border as they flee from this ongoing military campaign. The Russian aircraft are supporting the Assad regime. We're expecting much more heavy fighting in the days to come, but clearly many are worried, to include the United Nations and aid groups, of a humanitarian disaster as this military campaign backed by Bashar al-Assad and the Russian military continues in the province of Idlib.
Okay, Oubai, many thanks for talking us through all that. Oubai Shahbandar there for us, TRT World's defense analyst.